My name's Evan Basalik. I'm in the support team for Microsoft for Azure. And that's the first important thing. I'm not in sales. I'm not a TAM. I don't have anything to do with that size. If it doesn't work, people end up calling me, so I will be honest. If it doesn't work, I'll tell you. Right? So this focus today is, Kevin asked me here to talk to you guys about Azure in general. And, we were trying to talk about, how deep should we go on this, and where we landed on was kind of some overarching Azure stuff. If you guys have questions that go deeper, I can certainly talk about that as well. Before we kind of get going, to give me a sense of this, how many folks do we have that are kind of IC, technical, hardcore technical folks? Okay, how about more on the management side? How about somebody doesn't want to admit which side they're on? Okay. Again, the goal of this is to kind of cover both sides. And I also encourage you, please interrupt me as I'm going along for questions, right? Because I'd rather get them addressed as we go through than later. So just real quick background. So I've been with Microsoft since 2005. I started on the SQL Server team. And probably about 7 years ago, I saw a demonstration of this product called SQL Server Data Services. And I thought it was the coolest thing since sliced bread. This was, sort of equivalent to SQL Server running in the cloud. You didn't have to set up anything. You didn't have to install anything. Just click the button and you had a new server. And after, I don't know if any of you have ever installed and set up SQL Server. It can be a little finicky, especially if you try and do it on a cluster, right? So I wanted, I was really excited about that. And it turned out well. For a while, I got more and more into Azure, and eventually, the industry is starting to move that direction. As a company, we've definitely pivoted in that direction. That's good for me because I don't remember on-premises stuff. So it's been a good move. But I moved to Windows about 18 months ago. Spent some time with the identity team doing Office 365, Azure AD support, and then when we launched the team, we call ourselves Windows on Azure, but we support running Windows in Azure, of course. But we also do a lot of networking scenarios. So first things first. So my mother is an English minor. I would be very remiss if I did not at least mention that it is on-premises is the correct term. Now, you can get away with on-prem. But if you guys catch me using on-premise, like 50 lashes. I mean, in a heartbeat. Feel free. But, again, I suspect the English language being what it is, it's going to become on-premise over time because so many people use it wrong. But fighting a good fight here. So we're going to talk about some basic terms, concepts, also some myths and misperceptions. Right? I don't know what you guys actually know about Azure. Show of hands, first off, who knows what Azure is? Okay. Has anybody played with it? Spun up a VM, spun up a database? Okay, this sounds like it'll be the first exposure for a bunch of you guys. And so I will actually put some demos in here. I'll show you guys actually creating some VMs and creating some other resources. It won't be super exciting because I click a button in the portal and 5 to 10 minutes later I have a virtual machine. But you'll get, exactly. I mean, it's kind of exciting from that sense, but it's kind of not as dramatic as installing something and you see all the bits and stuff. So first off, just kind of level set, right? So what is Microsoft Azure? So this is our solution for the cloud, right? It aggregates all the resources you need to build a workload in the cloud or to build a hybrid workload, right? Where you extend your existing data center or you have some of your resources on premises. It's comprised of IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service. You can kind of think about IaaS as that is, all we give you is the hardware. You're responsible for, we'll set up the OS for you the first time, but after that, you're on your own. If you don't patch it, it's not me. And then we've got PaaS, Platform as a Service. That one, if you've ever dealt with IIS, it's really kind of conceptually similar to that where you don't know a whole lot about how IIS is configured. You just give it your web pages, you give it the ASP.NET code, and everything else works for you. PaaS is very similar. You deploy a special kind of package. We spin up your code for you. You're not responsible for patching the OS. You're not responsible for maintaining the hardware. You're just responsible for your app. As you can imagine, existing applications don't necessarily work well in that solution. You do have to change your code a little bit. So it's not for everybody, but if you're doing new development today, I mean, who has fought getting a Windows patch on a machine at some point in their life? Right? That's frustrating. And I've not had to deal with that since I moved to Azure. And then we've got SaaS. So SaaS, technically, that's software as a service. That's technically not Azure. We have a couple of services in the Azure space that are pretty close to SaaS. But that's really, Office 365 is really the best example of that we have. Right? You just sign up. You don't know if it's Exchange behind the mail servers, or it could be some Linux application, right? You don't know. You just get your email. That's all you really care. Right? So Office 365 is kind of the good example of SaaS. Azure's hybrid ready. Right? Some of the cloud solutions out there, one of the big challenges is they say, yeah, deploy all your stuff, but there's no way to get back on premises. Right? This is kind of the issue if you've ever hosted a website or something with GoDaddy or some of the other hosting companies. Great, I can put a SQL server up there kind of virtually. I can put a website, but if my data is back at my house or back in my on-premises data center, there isn't a good way to get there. Azure is kind of designed from the ground up to say, we assume you're going to want to connect the two environments. You don't have to, but we assume that if you want to, you can. Open and flexible. So I see kind of a range of ages out here, but who remembers the days back when, if you were talking to somebody from Microsoft, heaven forbid you mentioned Apple or Mac or Linux or open source or anything, right? It was like, forget it. And I don't know if you guys have seen it. I watch some of these things because the cloud is my life now. But when we were demonstrating some of the Azure releases I think it was in December, January timeframe, they demoed them on an iPad. Right? That never would have happened years ago. And today, we actually, when you run in Azure, you can run Linux. You can run a couple different flavors of Linux. You can run Windows. We don't really care. And in the support world, we're still trying to figure out how we work that aspect of it. Because I don't know a lot about Linux. I didn't write Linux. I don't know the developers who wrote Linux. So I can't troubleshoot it to the same extent that I can Windows. But we really are trying to figure out how do we do this because we don't really care what you run. Right? We want to be the platform underneath what you do. And really, we want to take that away from you, right? Let's be honest. Who got into the IT business to set up servers and install patches and everything else? No, we got in because we like the technology, we like applications, or we have a business we're running, right? And you have to have a website or you have to have a database. We don't really care about the other pieces. That's just implementation. Always up, always on. There are service impacting events, we call them, SIEs. But as a broad scale, the data centers don't go down. And when they go down, when we have a problem, they almost always recover on their own. The systems are built to recover dynamically. So we don't have to go in and reset servers generally. We don't have to go in and reboot apps. We don't have to do any of that. Now, we go back and figure out why it went down. But it comes back up very quickly. And actually, I've been running a virtual machine out there for probably 2 years for my own personal use. I've got a couple apps I've developed and written. It's not gone down that I've ever seen in 2 years. Now, I'm sure it has. It's been rebooted. It's changed physical hosts. But I've never tried to use it, and it wasn't there. I can't say the same thing for my laptop or my server that I run at my house. I'm fighting that stuff all the time. Economical and scalable. Right? You can do anything from one virtual machine to 50,000 virtual machines. Basically, if you can... At a certain point, we ask you for proof that you can pay for it before you spin up the resources. But once you demonstrate you can pay for it, spin up all you want. We don't really care. We can scale to whatever you want to do. And actually, from an economics perspective, so I went back and did some math. About 18 months ago when I first started in this Azure world, I looked at the prices and said, okay, I can run, this is the server that I'm running in, or virtual machine that I'm running in Azure today. I can run it for a month for about, I think it was about $140, $150. 2 cores, 2 or 3 gigs of RAM, nothing fancy, but a decent one. And it would basically use my month's allotment that I would get through my MSDN subscription. These days, wait a minute, sign out of this. So these days, I can do the same exact server, and I'm running it today for less than $30 a month. Right? So if anything, there's more functionality out there, and prices are going down. And it's everywhere, right? I don't know about you guys, what businesses you work with, where your customers are. We've got 16 data centers running today. We've got several more announced that are coming. Eventually, this will all be in the cloud, but it will all be local at one level, right? It's going to be where your customers are, you're going to be able to deploy your applications there. And so I kind of talked about some of this, but just to give some examples of the different types, right? Infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, right? If you've ever used Hyper-V or VMware, you spin up these days, very few machines are actually physical machines, right? They're almost always virtualized. The host is physical, but the machines themselves, the guests, are almost always virtualized. Azure VMs are the classic, right? You just click a button and you've got a new virtual machine that starts up. Platform as a service. The worker roles and web roles, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, but basically you can deploy your code to those. They're kind of encapsulated. Those are where we maintain the OS for you. You just manage your code. SQL database, it's where I can create a database instance on the fly. Don't have to install anything. Mobile services, right? This is actually really one of the signs to me when I saw this. It was almost heretical, right? We released, so mobile services is like you can tie your store apps, Windows Store apps, or your Android apps, or iOS apps, or your Windows Phone apps into this back end so that you can store data, you can share settings, allow people to roam their data across their devices, right? Really create that unified experience for your customers. The first SDK that we released for mobile services was iOS. The second one was Android. Windows Phone came several months later. Now, I get it. We don't have the market share, right? And so we did what the market wanted, but that was completely different than we would have acted 10 years ago, right? What's that? I agree completely. Yeah, so the comment up here, just for everybody who can hear it, was that this is a trend that we see. We see this across the platforms. It's as an outsider looking in. So I have a Windows Phone, but I don't really have it. I don't support that product directly. I write apps for it, but that's just because I like writing apps. And a successful app for me is like 10,000 downloads over 3 years, right? So I'm not super big into that, but it is definitely a mantra where we're moving to where we provide this service and the solution. And the hardware's great, but for the hardware, we're really after demonstrating what a first class thing is. But it may not be what we launch first. It kills me sometimes because I can't run it myself. So, and then like we said, software as a service, we talked about Office 365. We also have our contact relationship software CRM online. That product was one of the first ones that I don't believe we even to these days sell an on-premises version of that. I'm almost positive if it's not fully cloud now, it's going to be very soon. I know they've been talking about it. So when we talk about Azure, we're going to talk about some different resources. Like you'll hear me talk about compute, you'll hear me talk about networking and storage. Right? When I'm talking about compute, I'm talking about virtual machines. Be they worker roles and web roles in PaaS, or whether they're virtual machines in IaaS. And we have a bunch of different sizes of those. And I'll show you kind of some of the specs for those. We also have websites, Azure websites. This is fundamentally a hyperscale IaaS farm. Super scalable. Actually, the really interesting thing I like about websites is you can, for $0 up to, I don't know the exact number, X number of requests or bytes per month, you can have 10 free Azure websites per data center if you want. So I have several websites sitting out there that I get low traffic, but I needed a website. It cost me nothing. Right now, where we do charge is if you have egress traffic, right? So traffic leaving the data center, we charge for that. To be honest, I think it's, 1 cent per 10,000 requests. If I get 1,000 requests a month, I'm thrilled, right? So, I don't get the bill for the quarter of a penny that I could. But again, if you're starting a business or starting an application, you can't beat that, right? So let's be honest. If you were successful and had millions of hits and were making money, I'm pretty sure you're okay paying some money for the resources. You just don't want to pay for them up front, right? Talk about, so it's tax season now. So every year, so I was on the SQL Server team for a long time, and every year, right about this time, Intuit would open up a case with us and say, hey, we want you guys to be proactively engaged so that as we get close to tax day, if something goes wrong, we have this direct channel to your best folks and you're already there. That challenge still exists, right? They still have this business compressed in a really small time window. But I don't even know the answer to this. How many servers do you think Intuit has running to handle the load during tax season? I mean, it's probably hundreds of web servers, multiple SQL servers always on so that you've got the data shared across multiple places. But what do those servers do the rest of the year? I mean, who files their taxes in September? I mean, a few people do, but they pay penalties, right? So it's not many. Those servers are sitting there gathering dust. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, you will certainly see companies, and again, in some ways I use, Intuit as the example, right? Because they're the one that everybody gets. But yeah, there are certainly businesses out there that offer the ability, hey, I have all these servers, I'll rent them out to you. So Amazon actually started. With their Amazon Web Services, they had so much extra compute sitting around for their peak traffic windows that, they said, hey, let's make some money off of these, right? And they're doing a great job at it. I mean, it's a phenomenal product. To be frank, we're chasing them. So the question is, what's the difference between Azure and AWS, and why is Azure better? So I'm actually going to let's hold that question until we get through. What I'll say up front is the reason I think Azure is better is because if you go to AWS, they've got a great product. I mean, they're ahead of us in a lot of capabilities. We're catching up quickly, but they are ahead. But what they didn't do at the end of the day is they didn't write the app that you're running on top of AWS. So they try to troubleshoot Windows issues. They try to troubleshoot SQL Server issues. But at the end of the day, they're just like you guys. They just spend more time doing it. They don't really know that stuff, and they can't pick up the phone and call the developer who wrote that line of code. I can. So to me, that's ultimately the advantage in the long run, right? We will end up with a fully unified stack if you're running all Microsoft stuff. And that was kind of the value proposition years ago, right? If you ran Windows plus SQL plus SharePoint plus whatever, they work great together. Better than if you're using third-party stuff. They're not perfect, but they work better than if you're using some third-party stuff trying to mash things together. Azure is really that kind of same vision. Right, you look at Azure AD. I can log into the Azure Portal using my Office 365 account because it's all one central auth structure. Right, so that's why I think big picture we'll get there. In some areas, I suspect we'll start passing them in some feature areas later this year, especially some of the hybrid stuff, because I really think we're ahead in some of the hybrid stuff. So mobile services, we talked about that, but again, mobile services, you don't even know how many virtual machines service your mobile services app. If I have this, this app that just goes nuts on all the different platforms, right? All I pay for is the number of requests. I don't know or care how many servers it takes to service that. And that's really freeing as a developer, right? Or as somebody who runs a business. Is you focus on the part that matters to you that's going to make your money. You don't worry about setting up the hardware and all that. And cloud services, same thing, the web roles and worker roles, right? Infinitely scalable. I have seen people who do, in essence, a website, but they have 5,000 servers behind this load balancer, all servicing the same traffic, right? For basically for the Olympics, right? For the Sochi Olympics, we served some of their stuff for them. They didn't care really what the cost was. They did not want to have a performance issue because they have a very limited time to do that. They scaled up like crazy, and they didn't have to worry about provisioning all these different machines. They said, here's my code. I want it on 5,000 machines, or whatever their actual number was. So it's a little bit small, but this is, so we've got a couple different series of our virtual machines. Let's try a little interesting test. Everybody here has a computer or has access to one, right? Okay. So We go on that list. We start down at 760 megs, one processor. Okay, who's got a machine that beats that in terms of performance? That should be almost all of you. If not, I'm really sorry. I have a phone. I could probably give you. So who's got one that's more than, let's jump a little bit. Who's got one that's more than 7 gigs? And this doesn't have to be yours. This could be in your organization, right? So 7 gigs. Then we go up to 14, 28, 56. How much RAM you got? Okay, so I think I can actually beat that when I get to my G series. I think, if memory serves me right. But I can, with the push of a button, all of you guys can. Well, it's about $10 an hour to run our biggest server. But if you have $10 to burn and you want to demonstrate that you can spin up a server that is massive, you can do it with a click of a button. I mean, I worked in SQL Server for a long time, right? Some of the biggest servers in existence are SQL servers, right? I probably had 15 customers in all the years that had servers bigger than 56 gig, and these are like big customers you would know. You know, the big banks of the world, the people that are running these massive workloads. And it's the same ones, right? They're doing that as their standard stuff. But everybody else runs a lot smaller. And they usually have stuffed, they've spent so much on this hardware that they've stuffed every database in their entire company onto this one server, which makes it a nightmare to try and make changes to, because you now have 300 different application owners who, no, you can't change that setting because it might impact it, right? So but they have to, because that's the only way to get the value out of that resource. So we've got the A series and the D series, right? The big difference between them is the A series is all our blob storage. So we'll get to storage in a minute, but we've got your disks are virtualized and they're remote. They're not on the machine themselves. And then we've got local drives for temporary storage, basically for your swap file. But we do have a variant that puts SSDs for your swap file, so a lot faster from I/O if you really need it. We've got our DS series, which, now we're up to 112 gigs of RAM. We're getting there. Those are SSD across the board. So if you have an application that needs the I/O, I don't have, I take it back. I now have an SSD machine because my laptop now is SSD. But I've, been around computers. I love computers. I've not ever had an SSD drive machine for a long time. Right now I can get servers with it. And then we have our G series. And this, I don't know how well you guys can see it, but 448 gigs of RAM, 32 cores. I can have that spun up in 10 minutes, maybe 15, $10 an hour. So if you have, think about that, right? How long would it take to order that machine and get it into your data center? First, it's probably several weeks to get it on your loading dock, right? And then it's probably more time to find a rack to put it in. And then you got to set it up, configure it, deal with all the hot swap stuff. It's a nightmare. But if you need it, you need it. But most businesses don't need that kind of horsepower day in, day out. Not to mention the fact that if you've got a machine that's that beefy, it's going to be one or two things. It's either going to be a host for multiple guests on top of it, or it's going to be running something like SQL Server, Oracle, right? Some of the really computationally heavy stuff, analysis services, some big data type things. But once you build that machine, it's built. And that hardware is there for until you depreciate it fully, and probably longer than that. Right? You're going to basically use that till it falls over and dies, and you can't get the parts for it anymore. This server, this G series server, which I'm actually going to jump out just to prove to you guys that I'm not lying. Right? Because those Microsoft guys will do that sometimes, right? They'll just say stuff that's not true. That's sales. Sales guys do that. Yeah. 3 weeks later, they're on the phone with me going, it doesn't work. Yeah, I have some friends in Microsoft that are consultants, but it's a really short list. We don't get along. Support and consultants don't generally mesh nicely. Right? Because has anybody ever heard a consultant say you can't do something? I don't think I ever have. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out here and I'm going to go to my virtual machines. And again, I apologize if this is, oh, wait a minute, helps if I, oops. Oh, I'm in presentation mode, sorry. Okay, let's go over here. Sorry about that. And let me actually, yeah. That's not the fancy stuff yet. Let me do one thing here. Make this a little bit easier for you guys to see. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here to New. You can see I've got virtual machines. Oh, is it? Wait a minute. I wonder if, oh, because I'm extending. Thank you. Okay, and you can see it. It's actually pretty decent size. So I'm going to go into our gallery. So you can do a quick create, which really just says, here's some basic information, spin up this server for me. But, it's, actually, let's go ahead and do that for this purposes. But what I can do as well is I can go into our gallery. Well, now we're going. But I've got all these pre-built images. I've got, a bunch of Windows Server ones. I've got some SharePoint images set. These are kind of prefab and built for you, right? So minimizing the effort. Now, once we deploy this, it's yours, right? You have to continue to customize it and configure it from there. But we do a lot of the heavy lifting for you up front. And actually, I'm not going to show this today, but if you go to our new Azure portal, so we have the old portal and the new portal, except for those of us that have been in the Azure space, we have the old portal, and then that became the old portal, and then the new. Like there's always a new one coming, which is I can't get my bugs fixed. But we've got all these. We can actually spin up a environment of several SQL servers to do SQL always on, right, which is a database, a failover type technology. We can do a DC, and I think it's two SQL Server instances in the always on cluster plus another member server in the domain, right? So 5 servers, a fully functional domain with SQL Server always on, which is, again, even if you haven't used it, just suffice it to say it's non-trivial to set up SQL Server always on. And it takes about 45 minutes to spin up all 5 of those servers. But I have a fully functioned, properly configured SQL Server instance of a non-trivial, fairly complicated architecture. Right? If I was, again, I did SQL Server for almost 10 years. If I sat down and tried to do that on my own in Hyper-V, just, or even in Azure, just one by one, days. And that's just watching the install bar go across. Right? That doesn't include the fact that, I forgot this setting, or I misconfigured this, or I typoed the IP, any of that kind of stuff. So, really some ways to speed up your stuff. But we also, we've got a bunch of, if you're a Linux person, right, we've got a couple of different Linux distributions. And if you're a Red Hat person, please don't ask me. We do not have Red Hat today. We would love to have them. We've got some Oracle images, right? As a SQL Server guy, like Oracle is I just can't stand them, right, conceptually. But we have their images in our portal now, right? And Oracle, we signed a special agreement with Oracle that they will support you running Oracle in Azure. They didn't support Hyper-V before this, right? You had to do Oracle, if you're doing it on Windows, you had to do it on hardware, right? Tremendous cost. And you can also build custom images of your own that you can store and repurpose, right? So, or reprovision. But let's just go here and let's go back. Now we'll go through this way and do it. So I'm just going to call this, and let's go for broke, and let's do this G5. And by the way, I have to admit that username is forced on me by my team. They claim I use it so much in my conversations with customers that I have to use that as my username. So I'm going to drop this in, East US 2. It doesn't really matter. We don't have this particular hardware SKU in all of our data centers. So I'm going to be honest. There's a couple that I want to pick from, but this one's just as good. We're going to set up an RDP endpoint into the server on the fly. And we're going to set up a remote PowerShell. endpoint. And one thing to note, right, for the public port for RDP, for any of you security fanatics out there, we'll do a dynamic port externally to your server so that somebody can't easily guess, coming in on 3389, which is what RDP normally talks on. As a ex-networking guy who's looked at lots of network traces, you're not really fooling anybody by doing it on a non-default port because the traffic looks like RDP traffic. But people wanted it, so we did it. Also, and I didn't show you, but let me back up here. If I do, won't let me do admin. And I didn't think I thought it was going to block me from administrator. Oh, it's because I have a typo. So it lets you do a typo for administrator. Right, it blocks that as well. So we do try and protect you. Also, just a word of caution. So when this is provisioned, right, and part of having this public port and this cloud service, the cloud service is basically going to be a DNS entry, so a public IP that's associated with your endpoints so you can get to these servers. These servers are on the internet. Right? They are publicly exposed. A strong password is not the same as a not easily guessed password. We had early on people get their servers hacked because they used, they thought they were using admin, right? Nobody would ever guess that. And they used P@SSWORD exclamation point as their password. It's strong. It meets the criteria, but it's easily guessed, right? The hackers try that. So. Yeah, so I'm in the Azure Portal right now. This is the management portal where you can manage all your resources. No, Azure is 100% public facing. So the Azure Portal is conceptually a bunch of web servers that are serving this up. And I'm able to, it knows my subscription, right? So I have a unique identifier, unique subscription. And I can provision resources under my subscription right through this portal. So actually, and I've had people do this when I've had other talks on Azure. If anybody of you is seriously interested in this, we could, by the time you walk out tonight, and I think, don't quote me on it, I'm pretty sure we have the ability to go in and say, I don't want to put a credit card in, right? I just want a 30-day trial with no credit card. I'm pretty sure we've turned that on now. We were talking about it, but I don't participate in the billing conversation, so not 100% sure about that. But if you're super interested, we can have you a subscription provision tonight and a virtual machine provision tonight. Yeah. So MSDN's one route, and if you have access to MSDN through those routes, that's certainly one. We do $150 a month in that. I've also seen that we've started giving that, to some of the universities and the like. I don't know the specifics of those details. If you want to follow up with me after, I can get you a card of mine and then send me the email. I know for a fact we're doing it, I just don't know the details. I mean, we're basically throwing O365 at people. Right? If you have a heartbeat, we'll give you a subscription for a little while. So this is provisioning, so we'll come back to this, right? But again, all I did was I was just in a web page configuring some stuff, right? Just the same as you might order a server somewhere, but actually less clicks probably than ordering a server. Sure. Mm-hmm. So if you're, the way we actually do it is it depends on whether you're talking IaaS or PaaS, right? So if we're talking infrastructure as a service where you own the OS, the first time around, I'm actually not 100% sure how we build the image because we only build one. And then we basically put that out and then you make copies of it from there. It's a sysprep image, right? For the PaaS instances, so the platform as a service where you just are responsible for your code, we actually come through and blow away the entire image once a month and replace it with a new copy of the guest OS, basically with all the patches in there. Now, how they build that kind of base image that we deploy, I'm not 100% sure. But if you're only doing one, I don't know that it really matters. right? It's kind of funny because like I said, I did SQL Server for a long time, and we invested a lot of money in SQL Server on making the setup process easier. You know, these days we download the updates for setup when you try and run setup. It used to be if we had a bug in setup, that bug was there for the entire life cycle of the product. Could not be fixed. Because we couldn't patch the setup, right? Just the way we designed it. So we redesigned that. I mean, we invested a ton of effort. That was what we call red zone internally. This is something that is a heavy impactor to support, drives a lot of cases or drives a lot of complexity to the cases. That was on our list for years and years before we finally got it. We finally have it, and now nobody runs setup. So I hope whichever PM, program manager, justified that and kind of put that on their review. I hope they got the review done and got their bonus and everything before we started talking about Azure. But I'm going to leave this to run while we do this. Does that answer your question? I mean, I don't know the specifics, but it really is kind of immaterial. Yes. Yes. Now, what we will, if you turn on Windows Update, you will get the patches going forward. And once you build, and again, differentiating between IaaS and PaaS, once you build an IaaS instance, it's Windows Update it. We will never push another patch to your machine other than through the normal Windows Update, Microsoft Update process. If it's PaaS, once a month you get the brand new stuff. And we do also, we try to not patch any more than once a month, but we do reserve the right if there's some nasty security thing that just gets discovered and we have to do a patch to everybody immediately because it's really severe. We do go through and do that really quickly. So once a month is kind of a guideline. Yeah, so with PaaS, there is the ability to say, I want to stick with this basically release of the guest. You will get the monthly updates, which are the patches, but you won't get like an OS upgrade. You won't get a service pack upgrade, for example. That actually gets a little scary to me because, one, if you're so dependent on a functionality in the OS that you want to freeze on that, I would argue you probably have a problem in your application design. The other thing is, too, once you go that route, if you kind of freeze your OS, man, when you have, because at some point we will say you have to move, right? Because it's just not safe to run in our data center. That's a really scary jump at that point. So I spent some time in PaaS because SQL Azure is closer to PaaS. I didn't see a whole lot of customers actually freeze that unless they really were just super, super risk averse, and it was really more about putting the risk off for the future for somebody else to deal with. I'm sorry? No. Actually, I have heard rumors that you can get like XP up and running in Azure, but don't call me about it. I can't help you fix it if it doesn't work. 2008, Windows 2008, I'm almost positive, last time I checked, will not run in Azure because we can't get the Hyper-V extensions working properly. Now, 2008 R2 works great, but straight 2008 isn't there. And 2003, yeah, no. Even virtualizing 2003 is always a little sketchy because we support it, and people do it all the time, but that's 2008 R2 was the first OS release that was built and designed and tested completely virtualized. Yeah. No, so if we go back, when I was looking in the gallery, and I just didn't scroll down far enough, but what you can see is here's a 2008 R2 SP1, right? So you can see that. We've even got, if you're an RDS person, right, we kind of have a stock RDS image built for you. Actually, if you go with our new portal, I was talking about the ability to do this kind of fancy SQL Server deployment. If you go to the new portal, you can do, if you do remote desktop services, we'll do your session host for you. We'll do your RD gateway. We'll do everything for you, right? And that's super hard to configure. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so the costing, we charge, so there's really two rates that you'll pay in Azure for virtual machines. There's the the permanent cost that kind of if you just go up, spin up a virtual machine and run. If you're somebody who has on-premises, notice the S, on-premises licenses, and you want to use, I think it's called license mobility, to move them to Azure, there is a slight reduction in the permanent cost. But within the gallery, we don't, again, this goes back to what I was saying before, we don't really care what you run. It's all based on what hardware you want, and we charge you per minute based on the hardware. So we don't really care about the OS itself. Correct. Correct. Yep. And if you really wanted to, so we provide these images out there. They're kind of pre-configured. There is some optimization we do. There's some registry keys that you want to set if you're virtualizing an OS, right? So we set all those for you. But if you wanted to build an image on premises, hyper customize it, do all your stuff, deploy all your apps, as long as you can sysprep that and it will work, then you can deploy that to Azure. So and this is something I may have neglected to say it before, right? If you've ever used Hyper-V, you're basically using Azure on a micro scale, right? Azure it's not Hyper-V. It's not a Hyper-V cluster. It doesn't use System Center to manage all the virtual machines, but it is nothing but a massive deployment of physical hosts, all running Hyper-V locally on those instances, all running virtualized machines on those hosts. And then the Azure Fabric manages moving those around and spinning up the resources and all that kind of stuff. But it's fundamentally Hyper-V. Right? We use the same interfaces, same APIs. If we have a problem with the virtualization stack, we go talk to the Hyper-V devs. Right? So that goes back to one of the questions I think it was you asking earlier about what's better. I mean, again, if I know even Amazon knows their stack, but you have to get past the OS. And if there's interaction between the two, that's a tough, nasty problem. It's a nasty problem even in my world, but at least I can go call both devs, stick them in a room, and see who comes out. Right? That's the one who had the bug, or didn't have the bug in their code. So let's go back to the presentation here. Let's see. Let's go back here. Yes, we talked about our SKUs. Let's see what we got here. Okay, good. Okay, so that was all compute, right? Let's talk data services. SQL database, basically a wrapped version. It is SQL Server under the covers, but we wrap it to make it super easy to provision and deploy. HD Insight, if you do some big data stuff. Caching, if you're a Redis cache user, we've got a managed cache that we wrote, and then there's stuff that you can do in the roles themselves. We've got Azure Backup. Right, you can back up files today to Azure, both from on-premises and Azure Virtual Machines. It's not just, the name is a little bit misleading, but you can install an agent on your Windows 7 machine. I don't think it'll work on XP, but on your Windows 7 machine, back up your files to Azure. I personally have 20 gigs of data backed up to Azure. That's separate from OneDrive. Right, I have a lot more stuff in OneDrive. I think it costs me like $2 a month. We've got Azure Site Recovery, which allows you leverage that with Hyper-V on premises. You could, if your instance on premises goes belly up, you fail over to the Azure virtual machine. And then when you fix your on-premises instance, you fail back. Now that's your primary. And then storage. So we have the ability to store blobs, basically just binary objects, right? Stuff whatever data in you want. Tables, so for unstructured data. Queues, right, for pushing messages for durable message transfer. And then files. Right, so we've got Azure Files. Azure Files is still in preview. It's not fully released yet, but it's basically a share in Azure that you can point your machine to and just treat it just like you do a share on premises. And then app services. Right, these are the ones that are a little bit closer to software as a service because this is really turnkey. If you've ever used Visual Studio for source control, right, for Team Foundation Server. Kind of like these days, everybody's kind of going GitHub, right? And so, but Visual Studio Online plays really nice with GitHub, and it is basically source control in the cloud, but you can also track your work items, your bugs, all that kind of stuff. Azure Active Directory, right? Authentication in Azure, and this I was mentioning this before. The Azure Active Directory that services Azure that you can leverage for your applications to do authentication against is the same Azure AD that you're using with Office 365. So you can use the same credential for Office 365 as you do against Azure for Azure applications. I can write an application in Azure today that does Microsoft authentication to allow only Microsoft people to come in. I don't have to manage the users. I don't have to manage passwords. I just say I want to tie into that directory. Well, they have to let me tie into it. But once I'm tied into that Azure Active Directory, I'm authenticating against, in essence, Microsoft resources without having to manage that. You could just do standard federation. So Azure AD will federate with Shibboleth. It'll do ADFS. It'll ping kind of whatever you want from that aspect. We're really trying to make that. If you don't want to have a VPN between Azure and your on-premises, right? Like Office 365, people typically don't have VPNs, right? But they need to authenticate, right? Nobody wants to remember yet another password, right? So there had to be a way to get your password from on-premises to these cloud services without having a site-to-site VPN for your DCs. Not to mention who wants to set up a DC, right? They're throwaway, but they're still a pain to set up. Azure AD was built to allow you to basically replicate those credentials in a secure fashion so that then the cloud services can use that. But what we're seeing now is we're actually seeing on-premises applications leveraging them as well. Right? So you might have a website on-premises. I have customers today that I've talked to in Azure Space. They don't have a single server on-premises, not one. They have client machines, and they might have they might have one. They have a web server sitting somewhere, but they tie it into Azure AD, and then they don't have to worry about managing a domain on-premises. They just do it all through Azure AD. For Azure AD, it's actually HTTPS and HTTP back and forth. It's all TLS encrypted. TLS is good. SSL is bad. Yes, we won't talk about the freak problem. So I have a friend in security who is not a happy camper right now. And then network services, right? You can do virtual networks in Azure just like you do on premises. We've got ExpressRoute, which is kind of our high-speed, low-latency. Conceptually, if you think about ExpressRoute is I drag a fiber optic cable to some place. Azure drags a fiber optic cable to the same place, and then the person who owns that location ties them together at a really simple level. Obviously, a little more complicated than that, but the private traffic. And then you have site-to-site VPN, basically, so always on IPsec connection over the internet. Again, in that case, it is public traffic, but it's IPsec encrypted. And then point-to-site is kind of neat. Again, looking around the audience, it's kind of a mix. Those of you who remember all the CDs we would get with AOL, right? All AOL really shipped you was a VPN client, so you could dial into their stuff, right? Point-to-site is the same thing. You have this little VPN client that it has a certificate for authentication that you get from the virtual network, but you can then connect to your Azure virtual network from on-premises from any machine. Right, so I can install this VPN client here. I can install it on one of your machines. It doesn't matter. I just give you the client and you get in the virtual network. That's really good if you're doing some proof of concept for a customer, or you need to demonstrate that I can connect on premises to Azure, but I don't want to set up an always-on site-to-site. Kind of gives you the functionality. And then Traffic Manager, which is kind of worldwide DNS failover. So if I want to have some of my applications, or one copy of my applications in the U.S. and then one in Asia, just in case, U.S. falls off the face of the planet, I want my application to still work. Right, Traffic Manager will just send that traffic over there. It knows which site's up and which site's down. And then payment options, right? So there's really 3 different ways to go. You can pay as you go. We see a lot of people do this. Basically, you give us a credit card, and if you use a resource, you pay for it. Per minute charges on the compute stuff. Azure Websites is based on the amount of traffic. A lot of it's based on the egress traffic. So we're not stupid. If you want to send us data, sure, do that for free. But if you want to take your data out, or you want to send data to a customer, yeah, we're going to charge for that a little bit. You can transfer lots of data before you start hitting significant charges. Again, the stuff that I do just playing around, pennies if that. Yeah. Oh, okay. I think we've got a break coming up in just a couple of minutes. 5 minutes, or do you want to do it now? Okay. So let me finish this slide, and then we'll take a break then. So you can do a monetary commitment where you basically say, I'll consume X number of dollars in a 6-month period, and we'll give you a break on the price. And then we've got our enterprise agreements, right? So if you want to sign a big enough contract, basically you get a bigger reduction in the prices. So let's take a break now. When we come back, what I'll do, I'll show you guys that server's up and running. It's probably well provisioned by now. I'm probably up to like $5 now that I shoot up on my corporate subscription. And then we'll go through some of the myths and misperceptions and talk about a couple other things. So thanks. So two things, because Alex had a question that reminded me I want to show you guys these two things. So we've got kind of the old. So we've got two portals, right? So we've got the old portal, which is the link is going to be. You can't even see it here. Let's see. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Maybe. No, it won't even. There we go. So if you go to manage.windowsazure.com, that's the old portal. Okay. If you go to portal, so you go to portal.azure.com. This is our, fancy HTML5, really responsive portal. But this is the other portal. We have a lot of new functionality in here. One of the things that you can do, we were talking about the workloads. If I go to, I think I can go to compute. Yeah, go to Azure Marketplace. So I don't know what's a good. Let's see. I think. WordPress is a bad example. Let's do this, content management. So I'm not a content management person, but those of you that might be, right, these are a whole bunch of the common content management apps that are out there. We will deploy a fully functional app and the associated resources with it, right? Some of these we build ourselves or partners build. But again, you guys can certainly deploy, once you build your solution once, let's say you're a reseller or something like that, right? You can build an application and then deploy it for multiple customers, right? Copies of that application, right? Super easy. The other thing that I wanted to show you guys, if you go, let's do Azure Calculator. So if you do a search for Azure Calculator, had a couple of questions around the cost, right? You can go in and kind of specify what it is that you want to use resource-wise. It'll give you a good sense of what it's going to cost a month. What you can see, like, let's just play with the bandwidth. 40 gigabytes of egress only, right? Doesn't count ingress, $4. Right? And, oh, by the way, you do get to pay, you can pay to talk to me as well. But if we go to, like, let's just go to full calculator here. What you'll see pretty quickly if I go to, like, virtual machines, I go to one core, 768 megs of RAM, $26 a month, right? So one very small virtual machine, and I've already equal to my pretty high bandwidth cost. Or, I'm sorry, egress traffic cost, right? So again, when you focus on costing for Azure, look at your compute. Everything else is going to be pretty minor in comparison to that. The other thing, common misperception. And actually, I think I talk about, let's go here. Yeah, so a couple of common misperceptions. I mentioned this before, right? It's not just, it is Hyper-V APIs and the Hyper-V functionality, but it's not just Hyper-V and System Center, something a lot bigger. There's also a misperception that's a black box. Right? Hey, it's this virtual machine in the cloud. Nobody can see anything, and you just can't troubleshoot it. Just Microsoft's just got to fix it. There certainly are some elements of I have to go get the data to troubleshoot in a different way, or you guys as end users of a Windows machine or a Linux machine may have to learn remote PowerShell, for example, which we've never had to do. We just RDP in and we do it, right? Excuse me. So you may have always kind of have the way that you used to do stuff. You may have to learn some new ways to do it. But the data is still there. I troubleshoot Azure virtual machines all day long. I have special access to additional back-end data. But that's really when I'm looking at problems for the platform, right? Not really with the virtual machines themselves. So it's not just a black box. It's also not just for new apps, right? We talked about paths and SQL database and those kind of things. Those are great for new apps because you can't take your existing code and just drop it into those and work. But you can do what we call lift and shift. Take an on-premises virtual machine, move it to Azure, it will run. You know, you might need to set up a domain or a VPN to kind of get your workload to run. But Windows is just Windows. That's also the other misperception. People think this is some highly customized version of Windows running in Azure or highly customized versions of Linux. And it's not. It's just Windows. You know, this is kind of a good example. I was talking earlier, we were trying to see who had what for hardware. Early on, when I was working on the Azure team, we had a customer call us in a panic, absolute panic. Sev-A case, so the highest severity for us. The guy was willing to lose sleep, stay up all night to fix this. His problem was when he stood up a virtual machine and didn't install anything, 56 gigs, I don't remember how many cores it was, but he had, 2.5 gigs. Let's see. He had 2.5 gigs of memory consumed on that machine when he first started it up. He's paying for 56 and he's only getting 53, so we must have installed something. We're overcharging him. We're not giving him what he wants, right? Frantic, right? Because he needed these resources, right? He's running some SQL workload. So we went round and round for a while, and then eventually I went and spun up a machine on premises with 56 gigs. Same exact number. Now, and this is kind of a troubleshooting methodology that I use in Azure a lot. And actually, I use it in general with the products I support. Just because I can't explain to you why something is working the way it is, most of the time I can, but sometimes I can't. If I can reproduce it, and you can reproduce it, and the other person can reproduce it, it's probably expected behavior. So at this point, we knew this was expected behavior. And so I went and tracked down some of the Windows performance folks that I know and said, hey, how do we, what's in non-page pool? They said this, and this, and they said, and oh, by the way, we have a structure that tracks all the pages of RAM in non-page pool. So 56 gigs of RAM at 8K pages is a lot of pages. We use about 3% of your RAM just to manage your RAM. Turns out, after talking to this customer for a while, and we finally shared this with him, and he finally believed us, he admitted, he's like, yeah, I've never used a machine bigger than 8 gigs in my life. He had a need for the workload, right? His workload was really struggling on premises. But, and again, I'm not mad at the guy. It's an understandable mistake. But this is how easy it is to get these resources. He'd never touched one before. I working for a small, medium-sized company, right? And to me, that really drives home the point of not only is it just Windows, but really your barrier is no longer hardware. Your barrier is what you want to do with this stuff. What's your business proposition or what's your technology solution you're trying to do? So it really is just Windows. Right? There's the KV if anybody wants to go, see if I'm not telling the truth. And the last one that I hear a lot is that, hey, this is just for Windows stuff. This is just Microsoft stuff. So I don't know if you guys paid attention to the history, but when Azure first launched, it was called Windows Azure. Because, we're Microsoft, right? We put Windows in front of everything. And we get on these kicks, right? You go back 10 years, it was .NET, everything. Well, we made a very intentional change from Windows Azure to Microsoft Azure. Because at the end of the day, we use it a lot, nobody got into business to run servers. I heard an interesting conversation on NPR the other day. On WFE, they were talking, Mike Collins was doing Charlotte Talks and interviewing somebody from UNCC, a girl up at UNCC. They were Girls in IT, I think is the organization. But they were talking about, companies like Bank of America and obviously Microsoft and like are helping to fund this program. And Mike asked a really good question. He's like, why does a bank care about IT? And what she said, and it's really true, is name a business today that isn't dependent on technology in some aspect to stay in business. Farming, right? They are huge users of technology in this day and age. They use it to decide where they should plow, when they should plow, how much fertilizer they should use, down to the drop. And somebody's got to run that stuff, right? So, but very few people actually got into business, or very few businesses want to be in the business of running servers. They want to sell products or make widgets or sell soap or whatever, right? The cloud, the move to cloud will eliminate that. Now, if you've been around a long time, right, 30 years ago, this is what, big iron, the mainframes, similar concept, right? But this is at a much bigger scale. I'd say there's a lot of distrust, not just in small businesses, but all size businesses. Yep. Yeah, it is certainly a legitimate concern. I know that, in support, right, we have this term called CRITSIT, right, critical situation. This is for our customers that pay millions of dollars a year. When their servers go down, we have a really tight SLA. We're supposed to be on the phone with them in an hour, and we escalate very quickly up our technical chain. So, they may be talking to me. I'm on the top end of the technical ladder in my specialty. They may be talking to me in 90 minutes. Right? They pay millions of dollars a year for this privilege, not just me, but the broader organization. I see more of the equivalent panic in this day and age for smaller customers because they're using Office 365 or they're using Azure and something does go wrong. Now, maybe their side, maybe our side, right? Something goes wrong. Things go wrong, and their business is completely down, and they can't push that reset button. Right? What do you do if you can't figure out what's going wrong with a Windows machine? Reset it. Right? Same with Linux, by the way, so it's not just a Windows thing. But they don't have the same abilities to do that, so there's a comfort loss. Going back to what I said earlier, I'm of the opinion, having been in this space for a while, and doing on-premises support originally, I will put the quality of what we deploy, the hardware, the management of the hardware, the management of the software. I'll give Amazon props for this too, right? I'll put theirs up as well against anybody's in the world, right? Because this is what we do. Yes? Sure. Yep. You name the letter, it's in there somewhere, right? Yeah. So the question was around compliance, right? Regulatory compliance, HIPAA, God. Yeah, so actually, I'm going to answer it kind of two ways, because I do know the answer in some ways. In other ways, I don't. So I do know in overall, most compliances we have. And we're adding some that nobody else has yet. Right? We just got a new one. The name skips I can't remember it right now, but we were like the first big cloud provider to get it. So that's part of the answer is we will go get these. We are investing incredibly in these. I was joking to somebody when we were coming up about the fact that I can't even log into my email these days through a web browser without two-factor authentication, without having to pull out my phone and the system sends an authentication to my phone and I have to acknowledge it, or they call me. and I have to, get a code, right? You've probably seen this if you log into Xbox or any of those, right? You'll ask for two-factor authentication sometimes. I have to do that. Sometimes I actually use 3 levels to go look at data in Azure, right? We are hyper-focused on making sure we can do that stuff. Now, when it comes to, so from a compliance perspective, we'll have them. Regulatory stuff, if we can get it, we'll have it. From a rules around, munging of data and those kind of things, I think the problem's actually going to shift, and I'm going to use Office 365 as an example, right? 5 years ago, governments couldn't be on Office 365. State, local and federal couldn't be on Office 365. A lot of, pharmaceutical places couldn't, right, because they had to be able to control their stuff. We didn't change what we're doing, the laws changed. Because ultimately, those businesses realize, and remember, the governments are the ones that write the laws, right? They don't want to be in the business of running those servers either, right? So the regulatory stuff is changing. Now, where we can, we're getting the compliance as is. And it wouldn't surprise me, to be honest, if we've got lobbyists trying to get some of the laws changed, right? But the reality is you'll find, I think, over time they will merge. It's not a today solution, but over time you're going to find that what the cloud providers can do is what is compliant with regulatory. Now, there will probably always be some classes of business that can't be there. But I would use as an example like our Azure Government Data Center is specifically for the U.S. federal government. And that data center, I don't have access to it. I have to go through contractors who, have, I don't know what clearance they have to be there, and they're on site. It's like Northrop Grumman or one of those places, right? The ones that do all the government contracts. I actually had to go to so just below secret, just to be able to get data from those folks who have an even higher clearance because they can actually touch this stuff. Did I see a question back there? Yeah, so before I forget on the compliance stuff, if you do a search for Azure Trust Center in your favorite search engine, Bing, but in your favorite search engine, it lists all the compliances we have and what we're working on and where we are on that. So spend some time there. So regarding your question on the SLAs, so if you poke around do a search for Azure SLAs, there's a document we published that lists all our SLAs. To be honest, when you look at those SLAs on the first pass, they're probably not what you're looking for. But I would argue that we are building something that gives you the tooling to allow you to still keep your business up with those lower SLAs by adopting, things like load balancing, right? So putting 2 servers behind the load balancer, we make it so easy to deploy 2 that on premises, well, you don't really want to have an extra server just sitting doing nothing. Right, so true story. Again, I don't know what you guys have for businesses or applications, but has anybody ever dealt with disaster recovery for Exchange or all that kind of stuff? Okay, who actually tests their disaster recovery versus says they're going to do it? It's part of the project plan. But and so someone back there raised their hand. So how much? I mean, you guys chose, or your customer chose, to spend a lot of money to test it and have it out there. And I guarantee you there's some accountant, my apologies to accountants who are in here, who's sitting there looking at that that hardware every month and going, we're spending X number of dollars on this hardware every month, and we've never used it. I guarantee it, right? So most customers that I find and have talked to over the years, they want to do disaster recovery, but unless they're in a very specific business or they have a regulatory reason to do it, they just don't. Because it's too expensive and too complicated. And to be honest, if you're running a website, right, and your DNS name is, abc.com, and it's running in this data center, if you want to spin it up in this other data center, that's a DNS change. It can take 24 to 48 hours to propagate through the world. It's not really disaster recovery at that point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so we actually, yeah. So we give the ability, I don't know if you guys saw, because I kind of didn't focus on that part, but I could pick the data center to put my data in. We have data centers in North Europe, actually in Ireland and in Amsterdam, specifically to deal with some of the safe harbor restrictions. We also have announced that we're going to have a data center in India for similar reasons. We have data centers we launched in Australia, similar reasons. Right, so when I was talking about data centers everywhere, part of what we're going after is not just being close to your customers, but we want to make sure that everybody can leverage it and still stay within their legal requirements. Right, that's why we have the Azure government. Right, the federal government has the same needs everybody else does, and we needed to give them a place to do it, so we had to put the data centers in the U.S. and restrict access and the like. Saw a question. Yes. So social engineering and the like, and internal is certainly a challenge. It comes down to, I'm not kidding you. So I had to go through an FBI interview to support Azure. That was the scariest interview I've ever been through. And what was really scary was after the interview, the agent was like really nice. I mean, she had like her interview persona or something, but I mean, she would talk to me as we're walking in. I mean, we go through a ton of auditing for that stuff, and if you don't make it, you can't support the product. Also, there are more people with guns walking around our data centers than there are people who are technical. Right? So it certainly is a legitimate concern. I go back to some of the things I would say. I've been working with enterprise customers for years. I would say they probably have just as many challenges internally, if not more, because they're probably not. I never got security checked working for enterprises in my life before I did this stuff. No, it is, yes. Yep. Yeah, you picked this. What the heck were you doing? Yeah. Yep. No, it is certainly a legitimate question. It's something that there's not a perfect answer for today. Again, it's kind of the same lines as the question over there, right? I think it is it's a business decision that every business has to make of, do I think I can manage those risks better on my own? Probably not, right? And do it for less. And if I can't, is it worth it? You know, what's the risk to me and what's the impact, right? The highly regulated industries today, they kind of sit on the sidelines and say, hey, I want to, but I can't today. Over time, that will change. But there will be a major security breach at one of the major cloud vendors at some point. There hasn't been one that I've heard of, but there will be one at some point. So when it comes to data, we get calls periodically. Someone say, hey, I deleted a file. Can you get it back for me? You guys tell me you have 3 copies of my data. And unfortunately, my answer to them is, yeah, now I have 3 copies of your delete. Right? Because we are really not controlling, like we're not backing up the file itself, we're backing up the bits, right? The zeros and ones. We don't really know what's in the file. We don't know whether delete was supposed to happen or not. But we do back these things up in, actually, it's triplicate locally, 3 copies locally, and you can disable this for a cost savings, but by default, we actually back 3 copies of it up in another data center that is geo-discrete from the first one. So it's physically separated by enough geography that if this one blows up or falls off the face of the planet, this other one's probably not going to be impacted. So, I mean, the servers are all redundant. I was talking about the self-healing stuff. If a server, so this is actually kind of an interesting thing, right? Talking about the SLAs. Our SLAs are lower because of the architecture that we built, which is designed, we built it to make the cost affordable, right? So we were talking about these really big SQL servers in the enterprise world, there's a class of hardware called Superdomes, right? 64 gigs of RAM, 64 cores, 128 gigs of RAM, I think. The number escapes me now, but I mean, these things are hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that's just buying it before you configure it and everything else. And if you want to do disaster recovery, you have 2 of them, right? So in Azure, what we did is we bought commodity servers. So they're not quite what you have under your desk, but they're a couple steps above that, but they're certainly not traditionally the level of hot swappable parts and everything else that we've seen in the on-premises world today, because we want to be able to, hey, if a server goes belly up, if the drive fails, just leave it. Just spin up that workload on another server automatically. Right? If your hardware dies on premises, you better hope you've spent that money on another piece of hardware, or you better hope you have those parts sitting there, or you're down until you get that part. Right? Most of the calls I get in Azure where someone says, hey, my server unexpectedly restarted, it's when we go look at it, not only did their server come back up 5 or 10 minutes later, but it went down because we had a hardware problem. And yeah, it was an outage. It was a brief blip. But they came back up without anybody having to do anything. We didn't even really do anything. The system took care of itself. So we got the redundancy at the hardware and the software and the data replication level. Does that kind of answer your question? I think that was you that asked that. Okay. And then to the SLAs, does that kind of answer your SLA? Okay. Again, do a search for Azure SLAs, and you'll read all the nitty-gritty details for each service and the like. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I honestly don't know. If you want to drop me an email later, I'll have some cards up here. I can forward you over some folks that might know the answer to that. But I don't know how that side goes. I'm kind of lucky. I get to play in the Azure space, but there's some questions in areas I can just duck and go. I don't deal with dollars. I don't deal with liability. Right? I just don't mess with it. So, and just real quick, show you guys some customers that are using Azure to big time. No, I'm not. Let's see. So I got 2 things I want to show you, and then we're good. But, I guess most of us probably live in Mecklenburg County or Rock Hill, or I live in Lincoln County. But Mecklenburg County is a big Azure and Office 365 user. They switched their storage from SAN to Azure storage. I can't remember the number. It's like a factor of 10 or 100 drop in cost. Pottermore. Anybody read the Harry Potter series? So J.K. Rowling has an entire site that she built to kind of extend that experience and get more money from the people that like that series. That's built on Azure. I was involved when that project first launched, and we were all up it was in Europe, so where they're launching from, so we were up at about 3 a.m. I was sitting in my office in Charlotte going, okay, if something goes wrong, I need to be here, right? But they had scaled up to such a large scale, did great. They got millions of users in the first day. Now, I'm sure over time their traffic's kind of leveled down, but they didn't have to redesign their app. They don't have this hardware sitting around. They just kind of scale it down. Our own internal, Microsoft IT, our goal is to get rid of all of our on-premises servers, or like 80, 90% of them in the next 5 years. And then Blinkbox. So any of you familiar with Europe, right? Blinkbox is, that's the grocery company. But it's basically a European equivalent to Netflix. Right? They do all their streaming from Azure. We just bought them. I don't think they're on Azure by default, but they're individually hosted servers, right? They provide the deployment. Last time I checked, in the Azure Gallery, which is kind of where people can provide images for other people to use, there's Minecraft servers out there. So I know people are running Minecraft servers out there. So let me go here, because I want to show you guys 2 things. I'm getting there. I swear. Thank you. And I have to sign in again. I spend mine. When I'm coming in from internally, I hit one set of ADFS servers from what I hit externally. So ADFS is Active Directory Federation Services. Allows me to authenticate outside into our corporate domain. There's this picture of this guy on a bike. I swear I look at him like 10 times a day. I don't even know if he's a real employee or just some stock photo. I'm so tired of looking at him. So this is the server that I spun up earlier, right? So it's up and running. Let's remote into this server. So again, you can kind of see that, right, this is a DNS name that maps to a public IP and a port. That's the random port. Behind the scenes, we're translating that to 3389, which is the RDP port. Come on. So again, just to prove that I'm not lying, what you will see when we log into the server, you'll see that we are running with 558 gigs of RAM. I think 64 cores is the count. Come on. Yeah, and this is brand new provision, so this session's never been created before. That's part of what we're seeing here. No, so actually I gave it a username and password when I was coming in. That RDP prompt, the terminal service dialog automatically throws in my local credentials, thinking I'm going to a corporate machine. In this case, I just replaced them with the credentials that I created on this machine. So I'm not actually using my Microsoft. No, not if it's not domain joined. Right, so we can deploy servers that are joined. If we use ExpressRoute, right, the high speed, low latency. We have servers sitting in ExpressRoute or in Azure through ExpressRoute where I don't even know where they are. Right, I happen to know that they're in Azure because I've gone poking around and I know how to tell. But you know, if you're an internal user, the goal is again in a couple of years, like all of our stuff's there. You know, so just to prove it. So let's go to this PC. So we have 448 gigs of RAM. And if we go, I think this is always actually the really cool perspective because we hide it, right, by default. Let's see, it's 64 cores. So again, 15 minutes, right? This has been up and running for a while. And what's really cool, I think, right, because this is the game changer, is if I log out of this and I go to configure. So this, if I do this, I won't be able to kind of show you this real time because if I do this, this will cause a reboot of the server. But I could take this down to a smaller server. Just with a change of a property on the VM, we'll shut it down. We'll take the VHD, redeploy it on new hardware, and you're up and running. Try doing that on premises, right? Just getting different hardware. So I've seen people go from the really tiny ones from dev test, and then they go to these big, huge ones, and they go production. It does, yeah, because your pricing is based on the hardware. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Mm-mm. Now, we do provide functionality. I don't know if I don't have any PAS roles done, so I can't. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I don't have any PAS roles that I can show you, but for the platform as a service roles, basically think about it like IaaS. Not exactly the same, but it's a good way to think about it. You can basically say if my CPU is more than 80% for more than 10 minutes, spin up another copy and put it behind the same load balancer so then I distribute the load more. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it'll scale up. It'll scale down. There's a lot of different metrics you can go after. Like I've seen some people say, hey, if my unit of work, whatever it is, takes more than a minute to process, then I'm under load, so I want more servers. It's a mix. The features that we're talking about are in the UI, right? They're in the portal. We have a real challenge in that more features show up. So just like anything else, right? What's the hardest part of an application to do is the UI, right? So our portal always lags behind what we can do with PowerShell from the command line. But there is anything you can do via PowerShell. So you don't really, you kind of need to know sort of code. Like PowerShell is not what I consider to be true code. You can certainly do some powerful things, but you're just doing a couple of lines of PowerShell to do it. Now, one thing I've seen people do, I've seen people deploy full server farms, configure, deploy apps. They use remote PowerShell to launch processes, to install software, and I've seen them say, hey, for each of my customers, I stand up an instance of Project Server and SQL and something, and each customer, they have a completely independent deployment, and they just script it out so it can never be wrong. I can actually say from all my days in support, the single biggest contributor, everybody likes to call me and say, you guys have a bug in fill-in-the-blank product, right? You broke something to do it. Almost always, they've misconfigured something or something in their environment. So this kind of avoids all that because you just script it. Yeah? You talking like computational fluid dynamics and that kind of stuff? Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yeah. So we don't provide GPU capabilities today. That's something we're looking at for the future because there's clearly a need for it. You can do HD Insight Hadoop type workloads out there. It's a big data type stuff. And I'll also say I can't show you the report because it's internal stuff, but I will tell you that I have seen a report that's in a portal that I look at for another report that we know who's doing Bitcoin mining out there. There's people doing it. I don't know how they make money on it because I got to think the CPU cost or the compute cost would kind of dwarf what you make off the Bitcoin, especially with the drop in price these days. But I don't know. So, but yeah, that's eventually those kind of things will be there, right? You can do like HPC stuff. You can the Windows HPC cluster already is Azure aware, where you can say, hey, put my head node on premises just so I'm controlling everything, and put all my worker nodes up in Azure and spin them up, and then spin them down, right when I'm done. One other misconception that I just want to throw out, because in case you hear it, I want to get ahead of this. So if somebody tells you that Azure will always save you money, there's some caveats with that. If I if I build the same server I have in Azure that I have on premises, it will probably cost you more running it in Azure, because we got to make money too, right? But what you can't do on premises is what I was hopefully trying to get across to you guys with this really big beefy server, is you can scale up and scale down as you need to, or if you don't need the servers today but you need them at the end of the month, turn them off, and you're not paying for them if you're not running them. So in the long run, if you manage your resources, you will save a lot. You will definitely save money, and it will definitely give you a lot more flexibility than on premises. So just, if someone says that, there's some caveats. If they're not putting those caveats behind there, they're probably in sales or something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it depends on what you're doing, right? So if you're doing virtual machines and your files are on virtual machines, the VHD itself is backed up. Your files are in the VHD. So if you delete a file from that VHD, like standard Windows file recovery stuff takes place. And we do recommend you use something like Azure Backup, even on premises, right? Just to back up your files. Where we get trouble is if someone says, I accidentally deleted my VHD. right? I was in, one of the blob storage utilities you can use to navigate your blob storage, and they accidentally deleted this file instead of that file. There are utilities in Azure that will make snapshots of these things. There are ways to make copies of your virtual machines as you go along. I would kind of put it in the class of the on-premises world. In the on-premises world, if you delete a file from a SAN, looking at the SAN, right, not through the virtual machine, that file is gone potentially, right? We have the same challenges and concerns, right? Again, it's kind of one of those horror stories. It's not that common, right, generally, because if you're navigating your file system not through your virtual machine, you're trying to go through a third-party tool that looks inside blob storage and inside the VHD that's in blob storage and then at the files that are inside the VHD, you probably are pretty sure what you're doing at that point, or at least I'm going to assume it. If you tell me to delete it, we delete it. So, but yeah, all the same backup policies apply. Set up a backup system, back up your VMs, just like you do in the on-premises world. So by the way, this actually, while we were sitting here, this restarted, and it is now about a quarter of the size in resources. Right? So now my cost is down to like $2 an hour or something like that. Still on the high end for our virtual machines, but just an example of you can really save some money by managing your infrastructure. Any other questions? Hopefully, my goal for here is you guys to walk out here kind of having a working knowledge of what you can do. I'm certainly more than happy to stick around, and if people want to see things in the portal, I can try and do some stuff live. If you have specific questions, happy to. And I guess talk to your coordinators. I'll be happy to come back if you have other topics on Azure you want to talk about. If Azure doesn't succeed, I have a real career problem. So, I'm pretty passionate about it. I like it. I think it's really cool. That's why I kind of went here. So, I think that's it, unless you guys have more questions. Okay, thanks for the opportunity to come talk to you guys.